It's been a minute.
It has.
What have you been up to?
Oh, all sorts of interesting things, which is why I wanted to do the recognizing growth.
Recognizing growth. I wrote it down. I'm still not sure exactly where I'm headed, but I have a feeling you're going to drive this bus.
Ian, do we ever know where we're headed when we do these
No,
conversations? Isn't
no, and
it the
I
joy?
and I appreciate that. I do like to have a couple of thoughts on the go that I can run with, but I don't
Oh,
always have I don't always have a story necessarily that comes to mind that I have to share. Um, so that's where I'm at.
well, I do have a story and then a story within that story to just really double down
A story
on
within the
recognizing
story.
growth.
Okay.
Okay. So here
Hopefully I'll
goes.
recognize it. Or do I need to recognize it? You have to recognize it.
How about I tell the story and we
Let's go.
find out what it is?
Let's go.
Because it might be a bit of both, right? Oh, all right. So in the last 2 weeks, my husband has been traveling, and then he was away for like 5 days, and then he came back for two, and then he went for another 3 days, and then he's back home. And so essentially, for those 2 weeks, I just like he just wasn't home. I mean, he was. We had my daughter's 25th in the middle of that as well. So it was that's kind of why he had to come home when he did, because I went, you're not missing out on that one. That's a thing. So, okay, so he was going away, which means I'm functioning in the house on my own. Now, that may not scare some people. It scares me.
Hmm.
I have never lived on my own for longer than 2 weeks, really, in my life, in my entire life. And it could be considered lucky, but it was also out of necessity when I was a lot younger because I was so insecure that being on my own, I did not function well in the world as it was, let alone being left to my own devices to function.
Hmm.
So I do have this default fear
It's like a big
of
exhale that needed to happen there, I think.
to actually function on my own, even though I live in a great house. Like I set it all up really well so that uh, all the food prep was done prior to him going away. So all I had to do was heat and eat, and everything else I kind of am very confident at functioning with, all of the normal business stuff and everything else. But on a personal level, I do find it difficult sometimes to be on my own, particularly at night. And so that was what my last 2 weeks was preempted to be. So off he went, and I'm now in the house on my own. And I actually found it quite okay. I had to do a few extra strategies to make sure that I felt more comfortable. So I do things like when I had a client call and then I was coming back into the house, I made sure that the house wasn't quiet. I had the TV on.
Hmm.
So when I walked into the house, it didn't feel like I was on my own. There was noise around, just a little sort of psychological helpfulness. I find it psychologically helpful uh, to have that so that I wasn't feeling so isolated and so on my own and so in my own headspace.
Hmm.
So I had a few of those things in place. That was great. And then about day three, I this is where the second story kicks in. I have been volunteering and continue to volunteer, but I am now on the board for professional speakers. And uh, what I'm learning is that when you do something like that, you expose yourself in a way for people to throw things at you because you're now on the board. So this is a problem. You need to fix this, that kind of throwing
Okay,
things
not
at you.
physical objects like tomatoes, like you're on stage.
No, but I think sometimes emotionally having things thrown at you can feel a bit like having tomatoes thrown at you on stage. So I had this phone call and it completely floored me. I was so hurt by what had been assumed, by the judgments that had been made that were out of my control. I had done things with good intention and they had landed incorrectly after hearsay.
Hmm.
She said, he said, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, how old are we all? But it floored me. The judgment that had was reflected back to me in was just I literally wrote off the afternoon after that phone call because I was emotionally drained.
Mm-hmm.
This is day 3 of my husband being away and me being on my own. And
How
now
long?
I've,
2 weeks?
yeah.
It's a
And
good, it's
and
a good
I,
start.
well, it was an interesting start. So I felt completely broken and I just had to work it out on my own. I didn't have anyone that I felt I could call about it or talk to about it because I couldn't work it out in my own head. And as that afternoon progressed, what I noticed was that normally I would spiral quite significantly. And when I say spiral, I, I mean, a year or so ago, I spiraled and was in a fetal position. So I have a history of feeling so broken
Mhm.
that I just can't get up and function. And that seems really odd because I can look like I'm a completely functioning adult, and mostly I am, except when I'm not, which I think is a reveal in itself because I think we think everybody's a completely functioning adult all the time, but I don't know that that's actually true.
Not a chance.
So So I had this double down effect where I was feeling isolated. I'd been completely judged and I felt really broken. After a few hours, I really started to question whether volunteering and stepping into a leadership position like this PSA board director is, what really was it worth the emotional trauma that I was currently feeling? And I actually noticed that regardless of the complete environment that I was in and feeling very isolated, the following day after a night's sleep, I actually got up and just kept going. I didn't struggle to find the strength. I had more conversations to do. I had to focus on what else I'd committed to do on behalf of the board. I had clients I had to face and do work for. And I just had to get up by myself. And I could. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I felt all the things. I emotionally felt broken. I emotionally felt like I wouldn't have the strength. I emotionally felt like giving up. And yet, somewhere within me, I found some strength and I kept going. By the time hubby got home, I, it was almost a non-event.
Hmm.
And I wanted to share it because I'd forgotten how much stronger I had become. I had initially thought, even with him going away, that I wouldn't cope as well with all the things that I have going on in life. I assumed that I hadn't grown. I assumed I wouldn't have the strength. I assumed that I wouldn't be able to cope. And then I had the other scenario where I completely broke for half a day. And then I was able to rebuild from that all on my own. Nobody else came in. Now, I don't recommend being an island and doing that all on your own. It wasn't my ideal, but I managed it with a fair amount of ease. And it was like, wow, I think I need to recognize that I've grown and that I'm maybe, just maybe I do function as a functioning adult more often than I like to give myself credit for. And so the reason for the topic was the recognizing growth. Even though I felt vulnerable and felt like I couldn't do it, there was growth in that example.
Mm-hmm.
I, I I often think that when we break, we assume that we're done, that we
What do you mean
can't
by that?
rebuild.
What do you,
Yeah, what was your question?
I said, what do you mean by that? But I didn't think you answered it.
Yeah, that we can't rebuild from that, that we now need to give up on that thing, or that was all too hard. I did question, is this emotionally worth doing if it's going to hit me? And then it was about taking responsibility for how I let that hit me, taking responsibility for the fact that I still beat myself up when I get emotional about something,
Mhm.
and that needs to stop. So maybe there's a bit more growth there that needs to be recognized.
But without the recognition of it, you can't do anything with it. So, yeah, sure. Yeah, I caught myself beating myself up again for being emotional, but okay, well, we can work on that. Without the awareness, you have nothing to work with. It's just kind of like keep flying by.
Yeah, and I wanted to recognize the growth that I had and didn't even realize that the growth had happened. So the fact that I could cope on my own with this emotional event that had occurred, and I still able to get up and function the following day, showed me that I really need to recognize, almost like pat myself on the back and go, actually, you've grown a lot more than you realized, Chris. Kind of cool. And I wonder how often we forget to do that.
I think I think that's an interesting point because I don't when you see yourself every day, you don't necessarily see the progress that you've made unless you and if I compared it to like a working out kind of scenario, if you have been training every day for a year and you haven't, you're like, I still have the thing in my belly, I have like whatever, right? But when you see a picture from the past and then you see a picture from today, you're like, there's okay, there's been some change here. Things have shifted. But without that measurement, without that picture in time from back then to now, you don't know where you've come from. And if you're talking from an emotional standpoint, who takes a picture of their emotions, right? Like there's, I don't know, maybe we could throw off some rockets or something right now, but I don't have any pictures of when I
I
was.
have to. I have to do the rockets because they're just so much fun.
But if you don't have any kind of like emotional like grounding or understanding of where you were and where you are now, how do you measure that growth?
Yeah. Where do you recognize it? Where does it get highlighted? Now, I do not recommend feeling like I felt the other day. That was not fun at all. But it it had a silver lining. It allowed me to see what that measurement, you know, that there was a difference. Don't know that I had a measurement, but I had a difference.
Well, that's the thing. There is no like it working out. Generally have a measurement that you're working towards: a smaller waist, a lighter scale, whatever. Like there's higher weights if you're lifting. There's something to measure yourself against. But again, with an emotional growth or internal growth or emotional maturity, like that stuff's not on any kind of scale that we recognize.
Yeah. And
it's a it's a feeling. How did I feel then? How do I feel now? But we don't often document that either.
no, we don't. We don't. I certainly couldn't tell you when it was I was last in a fetal position because I don't actually don't want to note it, you know? I really don't. I don't want to remember that stuff. That's not pleasurable. And yet it does highlight the growth.
What came up for me when I was thinking about this was being able to appreciate that whatever is perceived to be a bad event or a good event, or like the last time I got tomatoes thrown at me, right? Like how did I react to that? How did I um what's my part in it? Like owning my the way I showed up to that particular event or whatnot. Being able to recognize that there is, if you're still interested in learning and growing and becoming a better person, there's a growth happening. I think it's when you shut all that out and ignore it all, and you think you've already got it all set. Now you're in trouble. Growth is not there to be had if you think you've got it all figured out.
Yeah, because it's no longer an option. So you would just not see it. It's a denial, isn't it? That you've got any other growth to do. So you just go, yeah, no. But if you recognize that there's still some things that aren't getting quite, you're not getting quite right, then you can have the option to grow.
For sure. The other thing that came up was when you start feeling stagnant is when I know I've stopped growing. And it's almost like a restless, internal restlessness, like, okay, you got to start doing something different. You got to do something more. You got to get out of your comfort zone. You've got to kick Renz out of the house so you have 2 weeks by yourself so you can grow a bit more. Like, you need to do things that are outside your comfort zone in order to grow. Last night I decided to do something different in the way I coached my CrossFit class. And if I didn't try it, I wouldn't have known. I wouldn't have grown a way to describe something or to push people or whatever. So I tried a few things last night um, because I needed to push myself. Um, but if you stay in that comfort zone so long and just do everything the way you've done it in the past, there's no room for growth.
So the other consequence that I found out of this, and it's a good one, is that I've now got, because I got pushed to grow and recognize that growth, now I'm willing to take things that I thought were a bit scary and been putting off for a bit. So I'm now working on my new workshop. And I got all very excited and inspired and very, very excited, very passionate about what I'm talking about in there. And, and it allowed me to have motivation to do that thing that felt a bit scary 5 weeks ago and had kept putting it off. And yesterday I went, I'm doing this. Let's start. Let's make that step towards what do I want to say in this workshop? Okay, let's start making those notes. And so this potentially harsh growth experience of hubby being out of the house for 2 weeks actually allowed me to get on and do even more.
Out of curiosity, did this event influence your workshop?
I don't think it influences the workshop directly. I think I haven't seen it to that point. It might be because I'm still in the middle of recognizing this growth. So it may, right now, it feels very personal. It feels very within me and what I can do. I, of course, completely recognize that the ultimate goal is never about what happens in me. Like what happens in me then allows me to have better conversations later. And a workshop is a later conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen that come through yet. It's very much, I don't know that I'm in the middle of this growth. I'm through it enough, but maybe not to the end of it.
Like not ready to teach somebody about what you've learned about it, just to recognize the growth that's taken place.
Yes, which is probably why I phrased as this, suggested the phrasing of this. I think it's probably very revealing of it's okay to recognize growth and also not to have fully grown yet,
Mm-hmm.
because that's obviously yet to come.
I've just found that some of my like greatest struggly moments that I've worked my way through have ended up becoming some of my best pieces to teach. When I
Yes.
finally cracked the code to whatever it was for me, and then sharing that outwardly. but I completely understand that other piece where I'm not quite through it yet, and I'm not sure I'm ready to share with the world. So I get that too. But you got to start somewhere.
Yes, and this workshop I'm kind of basing on more philosophical concepts, but to explain some of those philosophical concepts, I will have to use my own life experience to make them more tangible. So they will come in, just not yet. I just haven't got to that part of the development of this workshop yet.
Perfect.
But yes, you're right. Using our own uh experiences. I don't want to say stories. I want to say experiences because if it's a story, it's still in the drama, it's still in the trauma, it's still in the guts of it. Where if it's an experience, we're turning it slowly into wisdom.
Mm. Like it's kind of like the idea of the appreciation, being able to appreciate having to go through the struggle in order to be able to learn something from it, being okay with what was.
Yeah. And I think for me the reason that it hasn't fully completed is even though hubby's home, that's great. That part of that story, that loop has closed. That's awesome. And no, I'm not sending him away at any time soon. I personally am traveling, but I'm not sending him anywhere. He gets to stay here now. Um, but also I haven't been in person with um the individuals that also confronted me that kind of broke me down for half a day.
Mm.
And until I do that, I don't think I will close this out in my personal processing. And I think that's worth recognizing as well, right? It's like just because I, well, let's say got over it in half a day, I
Hmm.
haven't fully. There's still some pieces that need to fall into place to feel completely
For closure.
for closure, for making, and it's more, I think, for me personally, it's about reassurance. It's reassurance to know that I've got this, that I'm okay, that I'm not going to fall apart again.
Mm.
To really believe that the growth has occurred rather than just recognizing it. And maybe that's the key difference.
And when will you know that?
Well, I'm guessing when I've been in person with those people to then see how that behavior plays out again.
Mm.
Um, and then we continue to grow and, it's this continued, it's the continuation, isn't it? Like you said before, we can't be stagnant. We have to keep growing, which means we have to go into uncomfortable places.
For sure. So I'm curious how you might do things differently. Let's say hubby takes off again for another couple of weeks in a month from now. What does that look like going into it, and what do you do?
Oh, I think what I would be able to more do is catch my default thoughts of, oh, I'm going to be on my own. Oh, it's going to be hard to sleep at night. Oh, all these statements that I say to myself. Oh, that's the other one I do tend to do. I tend to push him away 24 hours before he goes.
Oh, you push him out of the nest.
Yeah. So that my justification for that is to create a coping strategy so I can show him that I'm going to cope okay. So I
Oh,
go into my coping strategies
interesting.
so he knows that I'm going to be okay. He so knows I'm going to be okay. That's all my own ridiculousness. Uh, and that was the other thing is that, seeing that I'm where that behavior is and whether it happens at all next time.
Mm.
So it's about watching myself, I think would be the where I would want to see the growth in within myself is knowing that my coping strategies are actually a little different. I still will turn the TV on when I come back so that when I come back into the
Will
house,
you
there's
still
some
push him
noise.
out of the house the day early?
Emotionally, let's hope not. maybe only half a day before. Maybe I'll
Hey,
get just better at it.
baby steps, baby steps.
Yeah. And recognize that that's okay too.
For sure. I mean, I remember sitting here about a year ago and watching a bird take its first flight from like because I basically have like a bird hotel right in front of my eyes here, and I I remember seeing them like on top and not quite sure, and then finally just like fluttering down to like the next level. I'm like, I just saw a bird take its first ever flight. And I can't imagine how scary it would be that little thing who's never done this before and trusting enough that things are going to work their way out. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's crazy, but without a little bit of faith and a wing,
And
wing and a
and
prayer.
a little bit of practice and a little bit of being willing to fall down so that you can try it again.
Yeah.
Yes. So there you go. Falling down helps you recognize growth.
You just brought me back to my childhood. My brother used to, when I was, sorry, I have to tell this quick little story. When I was learning how to walk, my brother would push me, like would stick his leg out and I would fall over his leg. So,
Oh,
yeah,
older brother, I'm assuming.
yes,
Yeah,
slightly
yeah.
older, but probably about 2 years older. So, yeah, he would stick his leg out. I would fall over his leg. He thought it was hilarious, and I'm just trying to like survive.
Totally.
Maybe in his way, I
Totally.
got a little stronger. I don't
Yeah, yeah, you probably did. There's probably a few other traumas in there as well, but yes, let's go with that one.
know. We'll work on that one later. Awesome. Well, thanks, Chris.
Well, thanks for letting me share my
Recognition.
vulnerability and the what's really been going on in Chris's world in the last 2 weeks.
And there was zero renovations
Actually, there,
in the
well,
story. In the
in
story.
the story there
In the
was zero
story. There's
renovation.
no renovations.